Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 309. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast by my co-host, Jordan Tyra. Jordan, how's things?
All good, thanks. All good. Looking forward to this one.
This is going to be a good one. I can feel it. We are joined by performance coach, Oran Donovan. Oran, how are we doing?
Not too bad at all, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you, mate. This all came about from a post. I know you post some great stuff over on socials, especially Instagram. But you did a post on Goalkeeper, the specificity around planning for goalkeepers, and it's something that John and I spoke about a little bit off camera about getting a podcast that was targeted towards that. So when you send that across, it was like, perfect. We've now got a guest as well who can come on and talk about it. So it worked really well. But so I appreciate you coming on. Just before we go into that topic, though, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose my journey into strength and conditioning coaching in football is probably a little bit less typical than most. I would have come probably from a slightly different career start point. And I'll probably preface that by saying, my original kind of, undergrad degree, I would have studied physics and chemistry, and probably quite a different kind of start point to a lot of people, or a lot of those professionals in the field. It's definitely something that I think sets you up nicely if you study the sciences kind of going into a role in sports science or performance coaching. But I suppose it just kind of reached the point where you start to see, yes, you might have an interest in a given field of study, but I knew my calling was kind of to go and work in sport. Obviously myself growing up, I would have always played football. It would have been something that probably governed a lot in my life. So when it came to kind of choosing a career, it kind of seemed to make sense to me, that I'd eventually go into it. So I suppose coming to the end of my original undergrad studies, I'd already kind of qualified as a personal trainer. I was kind of used to coaching on the side, and would have done a little bit of volunteer coaching back in schoolboy football clubs. So to me, it kind of started to make sense that, this is something that I could maybe kind of make a career out of. And this is also kind of the early COVID days as well. So in reality, probably not too long ago, where it kind of dawned on me that this is something that I kind of want to take into a kind of a more career-oriented picture. So yeah, I suppose from that, I kind of took it upon myself to just get as much experience as possible in terms of coaching, looking at going into teams voluntarily, and just really getting as much experience as possible. It was around that point as well where I started my master's in strength and conditioning as well, which I'm completing in St. Mary's, Twickenham over in the UK. And that's obviously a kind of a brilliant start point, I think, for a career. It's a real hotbed for football practitioners. I know a lot of guys who are working in English football kind of come through the course there. It was around that time as well when I started working with Shelbourne Football Club over here in Dublin, and I kind of would have come in an assistant strength and conditioning role with the women's first team there. And at that point as well, it was probably my first exposure to women's football, and I suppose the difference in demands there, which is quite eye-opening for me, I suppose. And it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me as well in terms of really getting exposed to an entirely different game. There's always a lot of discourse, I suppose, around how different the women's game is to the men's game. And as far as I'm concerned, you treat them almost like different sports, so to speak. It becomes unhelpful as a practitioner if you try to compare like with like. The demands differ. And I suppose for you as a practitioner, that means that your whole approach has to change. If you try to treat female athletes like male athletes, you're probably just running yourself into a dead end. So I spent 2 years there at Shelbourne, and some fantastic experiences there. Winning a league title, winning a cup, and also then qualifying for the qualification stages of the Women's Champions League as well. Some brilliant experiences with the team there, getting to travel over to Lithuania, and really just, I suppose, being exposed to the kind of high performance end of sport. And to get that so early in my career, I suppose it's something that I really kind of don't take for granted, I suppose. From being someone who's still, kind of, self-professed kind of early stage career practitioner, it's great to have that experience. And And I suppose from here on now, you know, I'm big on being a really people first kind of athlete second oriented coach. And, you know, my career goal is just to, I suppose, better others as a final point. And it's something I touch on probably quite a bit on my own social media. One of the real kind of burning drivers for me getting into the athletic performance and sports science end of football was probably my own experience growing up as well. You know, I was similar to Lionel Messi. I would have grown up with a kind of growth hormone deficiency that probably forced me to look a little bit more at my own physical development as a player, and maybe doing a little bit of supplemental work kind of off the pitch. And that's really kind of what drove me more into the gym, and looking at how can I kind of get ahead of the curve from a physical standpoint as well as technical, tactical. So that's something that I kind of carry with me on a daily basis in terms of how I deal with my own players. So yeah, that's a kind of a broad overview of where I've been. I've kind of gone into my role as head of women's performance and head of women's strength and conditioning in Bohemian Football Club since last December. And that was coming in advance of the 2024 season of the League of Ireland. I suppose just as a quick outline for those who aren't familiar with Irish football, we kind of run a summer season. Probably one of the few countries in Europe that, you know, we have a different approach in terms of when our season starts and ends. So we run from, you know, February, March to around October, November time. So me kind of coming in December was coinciding with the start of preseason. So coming into the role there, it's been largely kind of dealing with the women's first team, but also looking after our two other National League academy sides, which is the under 17s and the under 19s women's teams as well. So a lot of moving parts. But it's a nice opportunity and a privilege really to be able to oversee, you know, the three teams at once. Most of my contact hours would be with the first team, but it's quite a young squad, and we get quite a lot of I suppose interchange in personnel between academy sides and the senior side. So for me, it's a really nice opportunity to oversee a pool of players where there's a lot of kind of fluidity of movement up and down between teams. So yeah, I suppose that's led us to where we are now.
Awesome, mate. What an intro, eh, Jordan?
Yeah, really good. Really like brilliant points in there as well. You were saying, Oran, in terms of early stage learning and knowing that you need to try and get as much experience at whatever level under your belt. And I think that's a really humble but also really good point for anyone listening, that, you know, you're never too, you know, early or late in your career to try and get experience at whatever level it is. So yeah, really enjoyed that. It was really good. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other great thing to see is that we've had a number of coaches now working over in Ireland, but more specifically in women's football as well. And there's obviously Evie that's now with the national team as well. The little teaser, she will be coming back on the podcast very soon to maybe talk about some of the work she's been doing as well. But it's great to see that not only is the women's game developing across the UK and Ireland, but more specifically, the Irish women's game looks like there's a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of coaches like yourself that are really striving to drive it forward. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of the resourcing that we're getting, it's only in the last 2 to 3 years that the game has gone professional here in terms of professional contracts being offered. And we still exist largely on a semi-professional basis in terms of players. One or two teams in the league have gone full time. But clubs are starting to see, I suppose, the love of the game that the fans are starting to have, you know, for Ireland qualifying for our first Women's World Cup last year. I think that's driven the game on hugely. You know, there's players within the league now who are playing in the national team, and that in itself is drawing fans to games. So I suppose the clubs are following suit now in terms of, you know, delivering resources, you know, sharing training facilities that the men's team would have, access to, you know, sports tech, I suppose GPS systems, speed gates, anything else that we might use in kind of high performance profiling for the men's game. We're now starting to get that in the women's game as well. So it's great to see that the importance of the growth of the professional side of the game is, you know, it's starting to be realized here. And you touched on Evie as well. I suppose Evie as a character and as a personality within you know, football, fitness and strength conditioning, you know, women's game aside, she's a brilliant role model for young coaches, and for myself as well. And it's great to have her now working in the country as well. And a lot of the players who I deal with at a club level, they'd be with her at international camps, and it's nice to see that the physical performance side of things is being very well looked after, and players themselves are starting to get, I suppose, more enthusiastic around, maybe working in the gym, maybe some targeted conditioning work on pitch and things that aren't the traditional technical, tactical kind of aspects of the game.
Yeah, no, brilliant. We got a little insight, Jordan, didn't we, when we obviously went over for the networking event with Des and Shane, with the coaches that were there, but not just the coaches that were there, but how good the conversations were, how good the questions were. I think for the event and the conversations that went on at that event, it was probably one of the best in that regards, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, yeah, nail on the head in terms of, I think there's definitely a hunger. I could tell from obviously being UK based, going over into Ireland, and then you could tell a lot of the coaches were really, really passionate. And I think I don't know, it just seemed like everyone in the room had a bit more of I'm going to put down the UK practitioners now, but a bit more of a desire to see the game really grow in Ireland. And I think because obviously in UK, like women's football's a bit more established. There's still a long way to go to catch up to the men's game. But football in general in Ireland, everyone just seemed to be really, really passionate about developing the men's and the women's game. So it was so refreshing for us, wasn't it, Ben? Because we could just walk in and suggest a few ideas and topics, and everyone was really trying to push it forward. But also the facilities, because obviously we were at National GAA Institute, weren't we? And you could see, I think the FA is just based down the road there, and I think some really good things to come out of Ireland coming up in terms of football. And so, like you said, Oran, in terms of the women qualifying for the World Cup last year, that was a big step. And also, like you say, having players based in Ireland internationally, but also representing the club as the country as well. Because I think traditionally they were mainly UK-based players, weren't they? That were representing Ireland. So lots of growth to come, hopefully.
Yeah, I think in terms of the conversations that we have as coaches in Ireland, it's probably only, and I would say as recent as the last 1 to 2 years, especially within the women's game, that as coaches we're working much more so in a development environment than a performance environment, and this is something that I often stress to kind of, I say younger coaches, but coaches who are kind of even coming up at an earlier stage than myself. It's really important to work in those more, I suppose, grassroots or development environments to, I suppose, better yourself as a practitioner. It can be quite easy to slot into sometimes, maybe let's say an assistant or an internship role with a high performance team where you're getting, a lot of analysis tech that can kind of help and give you a data-driven approach, as opposed to maybe load monitoring or performance assessments. Whereas if you're in a more stripped back environment, I think those are the times where you learn the most as a coach. You develop your coaching eye, you learn how to do things a little bit more based on, I suppose, guided intuition. But as a coach, I think if you're not exposing yourselves to those environments, where in Ireland, sometimes out of necessity or just the restraints we have, that's what happens. But that's why I think we develop a lot of really, really good coaches who have a burning enthusiasm, and I suppose a skill to be resourceful and to work within the constraints that they're given.
I think that's so evident in the fact that loads of guests just repeat the same thing as what you just mentioned as well. That when we talk about their biggest, the times in their career where they maybe develop the most, they always refer back to one of those sorts of environments. So I think it's absolutely key. Definitely. Let's move on to our topic today. So we're going to make it specific today for goalkeepers. We don't want to leave them out. They're a rare breed, but we don't want to leave them out. But let's focus in. So Oran, you did a great breakdown of the sort of demands of keepers. So can you take us through that just initially in terms of the demands on them, but how that differs maybe to outfield players? Might be a little bit obvious to start with, but then we'll dive in a little bit more specific from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as an opening statement, it can be like comparing, sprinters to marathon runners at times, and the differences are huge. So if you're looking at, GPS data, I suppose, within the men's professional game, you're looking at oftentimes, within the elite leagues, outfield players, in differing doses, position dependent, are covering 10K plus a game in terms of total running distance. with goalkeepers, we're looking at near 5 kilometers. So, you know, you're looking at already the total distance is cut in two. In terms of their sprint and high speed running distance as well, you know, we're looking at more, you know, in the region of 50 to 60 meters high speed running for elite male goalkeepers. And, you know, sometimes it's, you know, 10 to 15 meters of absolute sprinting. You know, you're comparing that with, you know, numbers in the hundreds and multiple hundreds if you're looking at sprint and high speed running respectively for outfield players. So to kind of open on that, we know that goalkeepers can't be run the same way as we do with outfield players. And that's something that I think is important to note from, you know, the really kind of grassroots development level right through to academy and senior level, is that it's important to separate both on and off the pitch what we do with goalkeepers. I think there can be a culture within development environments of throwing them into the drills with the outfielders, and, you know, the odd time we might isolate what they do on the pitch. But it's really important that in terms of how we treat them from a conditioning perspective, and just the overall distance demands, that it's not the same. If you're looking at the importance, I suppose, from an energy system or a metabolic standpoint, you know, it follows that we're not looking at, you know, a huge aerobic capacity demand or even anaerobic capacity in terms of comparing with outfield players. You know, you're looking at more, you know, phosphagen system heavy demands in terms of explosive actions. Yes, our absolute sprint distance is quite low. You know, sometimes we can read too much into the GPS data and think that it becomes insignificant. It's a lot of, you know, sharp accelerations, sharp movements. From a GPS perspective, we're probably looking more at accels and decels being a key indicator of load management, so to speak, or in terms of the wear through the joints. But it's high impact accels, decels, explosive actions. If we're looking at sprinting, you know, oftentimes if we're doing, I suppose, integrated, you know, sprint work, let's say into a warm up or building it into some form of conditioning drill for outfield players, we're looking at maybe distances of 30 to 40 meters, where we might want to kind of build to peak running velocity for outfield players, especially full back swingers, those who, you know, perform plenty of kind of overlapping work or, you know, box to box work. For goalkeepers, you know, we know and the data exists to tell us that that's not all that relevant, and it's probably a waste of our time to be looking at developing high speed over those distances. So instead, you know, can we look at isolating it more over the 10-meter distance? Can we look at varying start points, varying end points? You know, are we looking at a different type of acceleration or deceleration? It's something we might touch on a bit later, but certainly from my perspective, in terms of we're looking at, you know, transferability of movements from in the gym to outside. If we're looking at accelerations, oftentimes keepers are starting maybe from more flexed joint angles. They're maybe finishing in those kind of more, I suppose, deeper joint angle positions where they're staying low, they're closing down a ball. So from that point of view as well, the sprint demands become a little bit kind of further obscured, so to speak, in that, you know, we're running with you know, a task oriented kind of purpose. You know, we're starting, you know, set looking at the pitch and being able to read the full game. We're in a position where we need to be able to make a save. When we're coming to a stop, or when we're decelerating, we also need to be able to, you know, quickly adjust our body into diving for the ball as well, which means a quick kind of move from maybe sagittal to frontal plane movement. So those are the kind of key demands as well. And then if we're looking, I suppose, from a more musculoskeletal perspective, you know, I touched on maybe accels and decels providing a little bit more kind of wear through, you know, knees, hips, in terms of the kind of the sharper running work. But also we look at things like hip flexors. You know, goalkeepers do a kind of larger volume of kind of high impact, high intensity kicking. And then in terms of upper body work as well, which is one of the biggest, I suppose, differentiating factors in terms of our kind of work within the gym. For sure, you know, we need to maybe put a little bit more emphasis on, you know, prehab of, you know, thoracic spine, of the scapulae, the shoulder joints, because of, you know, I suppose the compromised overhead positions we might find ourselves in terms of throwing. So there are some of the key differences, just to kind of outline from the start, that I find obviously are the most important considerations.
It's a brilliant breakdown, mate. Really, really good. I think one thing that you mentioned there, just to jump off the back of it, is when you said about involving goalkeepers within outfield players or outfield sessions, you then referenced about the time that goes into it. And I think from all the things and the differences that goalkeepers are experiencing to outfield players, and all those aspects that we can work on it, like you just underlined there, that is, if we're just putting them into outfield sessions, that's a waste of their time that we could be working on the more specific factors, isn't it? And that's what we're going to dive into today in terms of what that actually looks like and the programming that goes into that. But I think that's such an important factor, because we were all fighting for time, aren't we? We're all fighting to make things specific. So if we're essentially being lazy with a goalkeeper and we're missing all these opportunities to improve on these aspects, it is just time that's lost and not necessarily nowhere near specific enough for what they need, which is exactly what you've just mentioned there. So I really appreciate going into the breakdown of that. Just a thought that me and Jordan were talking about this just before we start recording. It might be something you've considered, it might not. You might have looked at the research, you might not. So just give us where you're at with where your thoughts go. But the modern day goalkeeper now is essentially the sweeper, the quarterback. They're spending a lot more time on the ball. Like you mentioned, a lot more kicking, both short and longer. How have you looked at the differences from how that's impacted maybe distance covered or the impact and the demands on the body? And if not, like what are your sort of thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, it's a great point. Obviously from a purely technical perspective, we know that the role of a goalkeeper has changed quite significantly in recent years. I think it's a difficult one to answer from I suppose a research oriented or kind of data driven perspective, purely because you're looking at it's quite a gradual shift, I suppose, in terms of the role. It's hard to be I suppose discreet in terms of saying where do we look at traditional keepers and I suppose the modern day keeper in isolation. You're kind of weighing that up as well with the more modern useful GPS data on goalkeepers being only available in more recent years. So I think our data driven and kind of research based approach and understanding of goalkeepers is probably more largely based on the modern sweeper keeper. So I think from that perspective, it's probably a safe bet to look at the data we do have and say, okay, this is something that we can, contextualize as a modern day goalkeeper, a keeper that covers, 5K in a game and has 60 meters of high speed running. That's a sweeper keeper. And that's the demands of a goalkeeper that, we have in today's elite game. I think obviously that trend of being a goalkeeper who's as technically adept as your outfielders, that, that feeds into, I suppose, your academy systems as well. So this is the type of goalkeeper we're producing now. So I think it's, to answer the question more briefly, it's probably a safe bet to look at the data that we have now and work towards that as an end goal of the physical demands of the modern keeper.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think like you mentioned, everything that you sort of brought up there, which we'll dive into, is the current demands, isn't it? So and also a lot are playing the same way, aren't they? You see majority of all sorts of different levels. And there was a couple of cup games last night where you got teams playing out against Man City, and so you've seen pretty much majority of teams now playing a similar sort of way. And in that, you're probably going to have a keeper that is going to be playing that sort of way as well. Just to jump on the point around accels and decels, obviously really important. You've mentioned the difference in distance for accels, which is obviously that comes apparent in terms of what the keeper actually needs to do, what they need to be ready for. What about programming for that? So we obviously programming for outfield players, accels, decels, we've talked about that before. But in terms of the programming for goalkeepers for an accel and a decel, how much maybe isolation work would you be looking to do, and how much will be incorporated into the goalkeeper drills and the things that they're going to do more with the keeper coach?
Yeah, so look, it's a great point in terms of the accels and decels. I mean, first of all, in terms of I suppose our needs analysis, we look at a very different type of acceleration and deceleration profile for goalkeepers. For example, we're talking about maybe 180-degree cuts that an outfield player might perform. That's not going to be relevant to a goalkeeper. We're talking about, starting from that kind of athletic position, you know, accelerating through the sagittal plane, keeping, I suppose, a focus on the game, towards maybe moving into a lateral movement. So it might be a more 90-degree cut, and that's, you know, maybe translating from a sharp acceleration into a lateral movement into a dive. It could be backtracking into I suppose a side on reverse movement, something I might touch on a little bit later on today. But if we're talking about, I suppose, reverse movement for a goalkeeper, you know, be it, you know, backtracking on a transition, or, you know, dealing with a cross or a ball or a lobbed shot that's over their head, it's something that I suppose is worth coaching. Is that, how do we actually do a quick hip shift into a lateral turn where we're still able to move quickly laterally while assessing the game, but we're not falling over I suppose in terms of staying square on while shuffling backwards, I think is something that a lot of keepers tend to struggle with. So that's kind of, you know, the needs analysis we perform. Those are the movements we need to kind of assess. And then it's twofold. We build some of it into obviously our gym programming work, obviously starting with an ability to decelerate or to land. So obviously early stage in the season, we're looking at a lot of landing mechanics, deceleration mechanics. Can we produce that force eccentrically? You know, before we look at, I suppose, accelerating, you know, that endpoint is what, you know, I believe should be the kind of guiding point in terms of how we program our excel and decel work. It's can we control that first before we start to accelerate, and I suppose build high velocity, high impact movements into it. So yeah, in the early stage, it's a lot of basic landing mechanics. I think you know, my discussion here will be guided a lot on my work within the women's team. I think you know, women's football in general, a lot of the players that we're dealing with in the modern day are probably a little bit let down by maybe the S&C coaching and athletic development that they've had maybe through the academy structures. So I put a huge emphasis on pure movement competence. You know, can we keep knees, hips, ankles in line? You know, are we decelerating correctly? Are we putting our joints into disadvantageous positions? If so, can we correct it? There's a lot of that goes on in the early stage, particularly in preseason, in terms of how we kind of, I suppose, structure landing mechanics or decels. After that, we start to maybe build a bit of kind of banded overspeed movement into it as well. And you know, just so we're exposing ourselves to those decels at higher velocities. And that's done, you know, largely through, as I said, through the sagittal plane in terms of linear deceleration. Can we slow down while still facing up the pitch? And then in terms of being able to move laterally as well. So, you know, it might be some side shuffling decelerations. Can we keep our center of gravity in that advantageous position? We're not shifting our trunk too far over a base of support. So can we quickly turn from a side-on perspective, you know, from side to side without compromising our movement mechanics? That's of particular importance to a goalkeeper. Obviously, you know, be it off set pieces, be it off a ball coming across the box, can they shift laterally while maintaining, I suppose, that good posture without losing the center of gravity? So they're still within their kind of capabilities of producing an explosive action from that. So that would be what we'd kind of work on heavily within the gym environment. When it comes to workout on pitch, then it becomes maybe a little bit more extensive. Obviously within the, I suppose, the realistic demands of what they're going to be facing within a match day situation as well. But in terms of acceleration, deceleration, and I suppose, you know, agility work as a whole, I think it's worth noting that for goalkeepers, it can be a little bit more structured in terms of how we set up the drills. You'll often find practitioners, and look, myself being one of them, in terms of agility work, so to speak, for outfield players. How much benefit do we get in terms of using cones, using mannequins? Is it too static? Are we really going to gain much benefit or transferability into the dynamic situation of a game if we're just working between cones? I think for goalkeepers, it's got the kind of caveat for me here where it can be beneficial to work maybe within more structured cone drills, ladder drills, footwork drills. There's less of an unpredictability in terms of the movement pattern. You know, they're oftentimes working out of possession of the ball. So less of it is about reacting to human stimulus. Whereas with outfield players, you know, we're looking at you know, a constraints-based model almost being required to have a human engagement where there's a little bit more unpredictability. Whereas a lot of the Excel, Decel, or movement work that, you know, I kind of program for goalkeepers on pitch, it would be, you know, with usually a constraints-based approach, purely because I find it's the easiest way to minimize, you know, the misinterpretation of coaching cues. But we use a lot of cones. If we're talking about shifting the body, can we use a you know, maybe a cone or a ladder constraint to, I suppose, cue them to shift the hips properly? Is that first step in terms of maybe, you know, doing a 90-degree, you know, change of body position? Is that being performed correctly? Can we use a cone to cue that properly? Then can we start to build upon that and say, okay, if we're looking at dealing with maybe a cross or a lob shot over the top, we're going from square stance to side on. Can we use a cone maybe to cue that first step to be, you know, accurate or right in terms of getting the right body position? And from there, is there, you know, maybe a setup of cones or ladders or whatever it is that we can maybe look at ideal distancing of foot position in terms of how we side shuffle. So it becomes a lot more structured than it would do for that of an outfield player. And I suppose that's the biggest difference in terms of how I program between, you know, speed and agility work for outfielders and for goalkeepers. You know, it's important that we use whatever's available within, you know, quite rigid constraints to really develop good movement, good footwork. Whereas with an outfield player, you know, good footwork it's a lot more nuanced than that, let's say. So yeah, I suppose within those drills, then it's about finding, I suppose, the right work to rest periods as well, where we're getting quality of movements in terms of sharp acceleration, sharp decelerations. I kind of touched on before that, you know, the metabolic demands of goalkeepers, you know, it comes largely from phosphagen system engagement, right? We're looking at, generally speaking, not longer than 10 seconds high intensity engagements. You know, whether it's dealing with a cross, whether it's a save, whether it's a double save. If we're wanting to perform repetitions in training, it can be useful for us to think in terms of energy demands as to how we structure that as well. So it's something I would have talked about in that original post as well. How we kind of rotate our goalkeepers, how we structure I suppose the time durations of the drills. If we're getting them to work for, you know, 30 to 60 second or plus, I suppose, work intervals, are we losing quality of movement? Are we engaging now in a metabolic demand that keepers are never really going to, I suppose, have to eat into in the game? So it's about, I suppose, for me, programming the right work to rest ratios so that we can, you know, I suppose, go through the more targeted footwork drills with, you know, good intent and I suppose good intensity on each repetition.
How much are you, I love the point on, going back to your point on landing mechanics and everything as well, especially for GKs, it's essential. How much are you going into jumping and landing with being, you know, knocked midair? Because obviously we saw the injury with Manuel Neuer recently as well. And obviously GKs can be susceptible to that when they're having to come through a crowd trying to claim a ball and they're getting smashed here, there, and everywhere. Are you introducing that from the beginning? Are you sort of building good basic landing mechanics to start off with, and then we're going to add sort of perturbations while you're in the air? You know, what's your thinking on that sort of approach?
Yeah, look, it's an excellent question. I think it depends on the training age of the athlete. You know, if you're talking about perturbation work in general, you're looking at an athlete that has, you know, the required training age to be able to deal with those unpredictable movement patterns. So it's something I definitely wouldn't engage in kind of early stage in the season, but it's something I'd build towards progressively. In terms of introducing kind of perturbation work, you know, there's an element that we might do in the gym in terms of you know, this might be, you know, a little bit of upper body engagement, but also in terms of core work and that transfer between, you know, stance and dealing with maybe kind of pressure coming through the upper body. But it might be some banded work, you know, the arms or shoulders, suppose, being put in compromised positions. You know, can we plant ourselves on the ground? Can we get strong, I suppose, bracing or transfer to the core? And then, you know, can the shoulders remain kind of, you know, rigid through more kind of isometric or, you know, sometimes kind of quasi isometric work in terms of kind of just building the joint health or the capacity to resist that movement in terms of a pure, you know, landing focus. It's something that we do more obviously on pitch, something that I like to do is, maybe bring something like an exercise ball or yoga ball into it, where, they're starting maybe against a more kind of cushioned perturbation, and we kind of build confidence in terms of their ability to land, be it single leg, double leg, and then gradually, I suppose, just increase the magnitude of those perturbations, where we're gradually building into getting pressure from another person, where it's less of a soft impact, so to speak. But for me, it's very important that I kind of assess where we're at from a movement competence when we're landing, and it builds from double leg into single leg, and being very competent and confident in single leg landing, single leg transitions from landing to jumping. So is there is that kind of repeated jump and landing movement, it's obviously less from a kind of an extensive plyometric perspective, but can we get good reactive strength off the leg as well? So not only are they landing in a really kind of static manner, but they're able to again push off and not only, I suppose, produce that eccentric force, but transfer that concentrically quite quickly too. So they would all be things that I look at both qualitatively and quantitatively before introducing perturbations on pitch. But yeah, it would start with, it might be as I said, a yoga ball kind of introduction to perturbation work, and then we start to build, reserve or sub keepers who are building into the drill. They might be putting a little bit of pressure into it from the start. It would look like maybe more, arms kind of braced across the body, a little bit of a push into them. And then building, I suppose, gradually into a more, are we actually competing for the ball? Are we sticking our head where we might be in a match day situation where the goalkeeper is actually kind of producing a duel, like it might look like in a match? But it's like any kind of physical quality that we look at in the game. From my perspective anyway, I build kind of a bottom-up approach, and then we gradually kind of realize it in a match day situation. So can they get really comfortable gradually under differing perturbations, to the point where when we're building into an 11-a-side training game, or even a small-sided game where we're dealing with crosses, that they become really kind of comfortable with the unknown, or comfortable with taking a knock. But yeah, it long story short, it depends on the training age of the athlete. But working within the women's game, I found that I suppose jumping and landing mechanics as a whole, there's probably quite a skill deficit there that needs to be corrected before we kind of put them into the more compromised positions.
Brilliant, mate. Just, I know you've mentioned there about the importance of landing mechanics, both unilateral, bilateral. Just going back into the gym work and more looking at this competency, you've talked about the sort of knees, hips, T-spine, scaps, shoulders, all these target areas that we need to be trying to focus on. Do you have like a set structure, a set number of movements that you're going to look at to put goalkeepers through? Is there anything that sort of jumps out in terms of you making sure that they can do this, this, and this?
Yeah, I suppose from a testing perspective, there'd be less structure in terms of what we kind of need them to be able to perform. We would do some obviously strength testing across the squad as a whole, in terms of maximal kind of lower body and upper body force production. In terms of how it actually looks from a kind of a prehab perspective, is that within the current kind of programming cycles that we're on now, we take one day a week where there's a large upper body prehab focus in the session, and that's where it'll kind of, I suppose, diverge a little bit from the outfielders programming. So for me, while the outfield players, they might do a little bit of more targeted work on, glutes, hamstrings, calves, other kind of, I suppose, more injury prone areas from, let's say, sprint related or high speed running injuries. The goalkeepers would engage in typically, 3 to 4, I suppose, more generalized hamstring strength, maybe adductor, abductor strength, calf strength work. And then from there, we might start to look, while the outfield players might do a little bit more in terms of, I suppose, isometric work for hamstrings through flexed, extended positions, and, I suppose more work targeted towards running related injuries. The goalkeepers would then tend to do a lot of work on, I suppose, lower back. So, are we looking at maybe some work on the GHD? Are we doing some isometric lower back extensions? From there, we'd also build a little bit more thoracic mobility into it. Are we doing it seated, standing, half kneeling? And And then once we do a little bit of mobility work, we're bringing a little bit of, I suppose, slower isometric or eccentric strength work into it too. You know, maybe it might be some banded pull aparts, different forms of banded shoulder abduction, adduction, extension, flexion work through, you know, as I said, more compromised joint angles that the goalkeepers might find themselves in. And then from a more kind of strength or force production perspective, concentrically, we'd work a lot more on things like, you know, shoulder IWTs or other movements where the shoulders are again in those compromised positions. Whereas with obviously outfield players, it's less about specificity of joint angles in terms of the upper body. It's more, can we produce that force? So specifically on a prehab day, but look quite different for goalkeepers in terms of, I suppose, just looking at compromised positions, you know, in terms of our T-spine or shoulders. We'd also probably look a little bit more at the hips for goalkeepers. Can we restore or generate a little bit more mobility there? From a mobility perspective, I'm a big fan of kind of, let's say, microdosing or kind of supersetting mobility drills within strength-based sessions. I think a lot of times us as practitioners, we can get quite set in doing them in isolation. For me, and especially when it comes to prehab work, it can almost suit or serve as a warm-up to the kind of, I suppose, the next exercise, if we can put them through a more dynamic piece of work. You know, if we're looking at maybe some, you know, more loaded adduction or abduction hip work, are we doing maybe a couple of 90-90 switches? Are we doing a particular favorite of mine, like scorpion stretches, world's greatest? And can we actually build those in so we're getting the benefit of both strength through range and, you know, more, I suppose, passive mobility work as well? So yeah, the hips would be another one that we look at a lot with goalkeepers. If you think of just I suppose the more long-term kind of movement demands, keepers spend their times more in crouch positions, so they need to be more, I suppose, mobile through the hips. And then if you're talking about the more explosive diving actions, you're looking at I suppose quite aggressive movements that can stress the adductors as well, the abductors. So we're looking at, you know, glute medius, we're looking at groin work a lot more than we would with the outfield players, purely because of the magnitude of actions that they perform, I suppose, through that frontal plane as well. So yeah, that's how it kind of differs in the biggest manner, I suppose, within the gym.
Brilliant, mate. So again, it's a really good breakdown. You mentioned about the sort of superset between strength work and mobility. And it was a while back now, we actually had Bram Swinnon on the podcast, and he was talking about basically utilizing the time that you have with players using velocity-based training, but they were also introducing some cognitive work as well. So I wondered if this was something that you consider with goalkeepers, because you mentioned before about sort of reacting to external stimulus, and obviously with keepers, I'm guessing I've never been a goalkeeper myself, but looking at keepers, the cognitive side is huge, isn't it? The fact that they can stay switched on for such a long period, and then also it becomes very intense for very short periods. So has that ever been considered for yourself in terms of the gym work that they're doing, maybe putting some strength work with some cognitive challenges as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. In terms of the kind of cognitive demands as well, what I think benefits me as a practitioner in terms of having the goalkeepers as a separate unit, so to speak, is that we can do a little bit more velocity-based work with them. So something that I've started to use a little bit more in terms of my own programming is, can we train with more intent, I suppose, in our lifts? Can they lift on command, and can they produce that force quickly? So what I've started to do, I suppose, is using IMUs, you know, which are accurate to varying degrees in terms of looking at your force or power profiles. But you know, there's ones I'm using at the moment are a company called eNode. They're a German brand, but they're quite easy, I suppose, to implement within the gym environment. You know, you're talking about, you know, sticking a small IMU onto a hex bar, onto a barbell, and then looking at, can the goalkeepers perform these movements, you know, I suppose, rapidly on command, and then looking at the force profile. How quickly are we producing that force? Yes, are they strong, but are we getting that on command and quickly? If that's, I suppose, the outcome or the target of the task. I'd be a little bit less, I suppose, a fan of using the more, I suppose, cliche kind of coordination work or hand-eye coordination drills that I suppose some might popularize or may have been more popular in recent years. I think for me, we're losing sight of the bigger picture for, talking about throwing tennis balls or, throwing and catching single leg, this, that, and the other. I think if we want to get really specific in terms of cognitive work, it's best to keep that for out on pitch. But in terms of, I suppose, concentration or intensity within the strength training, I suppose exercise selection becomes a kind of key factor in terms of how we can get them to, I suppose, it becomes a constraint, so to speak, in terms of can we get them to be really engaged cognitively throughout the training. So I wouldn't be a huge fan, I suppose, across the board, say, of using Olympic lifts or Olympic lift derivatives, as you'll probably find with a lot of football practitioners, just in terms of the, I suppose, the return on investment for the hours you spend coaching. But goalkeepers, it might be where it's more beneficial maybe to coach things like power cleans, where it becomes quite technical, and that in itself, I suppose, forces a little bit more cognitive engagement, in terms of talking about back to shoulder health, things like Turkish get-ups, right? You're talking about the constraint of the drill there is obviously not to let the weight, I suppose, collapse outside of the base to support there. So in, I suppose, the exercise selection or programming drills that have a high kind of, I suppose, task specificity, from that point of view, you're engaging them cognitively to a greater degree than maybe an outfield player who might be more going through the motions in terms of the strength work. For me as well, just in terms of the overall training day structure, we always perform our gym work before we go out on pitch. So that in itself can build as a little bit of a warm up in terms of then moving on to the less, I suppose, the less kind of force oriented, but the more cognitive oriented drills that they do out on pitch. So long story short, the more kind of cliche hand-eye coordination drills I tend to steer clear of. And then let that become, I suppose, more of the kind of technical work they do out in pitch. But it's about, can we get an exercise selection, or can we get that right to the point where we know our goalkeepers are going to be more cognitively primed, so to speak, in terms of being able to be more reactive and, I suppose, more explosive when they're out on pitch. I've talked a lot with goalkeeping coaches myself over the years in terms of drawing the line between coordination, hand-eye coordination work being beneficial or, I suppose, almost counterintuitive or counterproductive. And from what I found within my experience of dealing with goalkeeper coaches is that they prefer the more highly kind of cognitive demands drills to be done with a football. And that's in terms of just keeping the specificity and not losing sight of what it is that they're actually doing within the game. And look, I've had the privilege of working with some brilliant experienced goalkeeper coaches over the years. At Shelburne, I had Steve Williams, who was, former Wales international, played within England and Ireland for quite a number of years. Dave Henderson now is the goalkeeper coach with us at Bohemians. He's played within Ireland, he's played over in the Americas as well. These are guys who've been coaching the game, 20, 30 years. And I think as a strength and conditioning coach myself, who's probably been alive for less years than they've had in their coaching under their belt, I think it can be a lesson to learn that sometimes, we can get a little bit caught up in terms of, I suppose, running away with what we perceive to be the demands or the tasks that we want them to complete. But it's something that becomes a learning curve in anyone's career. But if it happens, I suppose, sooner rather than later, it's probably good, is that building that relationship between the technical coaches and, on this level, with the goalkeeping coaches, finding what it is that they perceive to be useful from a more, I suppose, cognitive or coordination or, kind of neuromuscular or proprioception training, what they perceive to be beneficial versus what, I suppose, becomes junk volume, which is obviously something within a semi-professional game you want to avoid just due to the time constraints. So those conversations need to be quite open. And with Dave Henderson, I've found him to be a brilliant coach to work alongside in terms of having quite open conversations. A lot of the drills that he would, I suppose, program for the goalkeepers are influenced by my thoughts on the kind of physical demands, and a lot of the physical drills that I would program are influenced quite heavily by what he perceives to be the technical tactical demands. you know, going back to a point I mentioned earlier, something that became more clear to me as a coach was the movement deficits in terms of reverse movements for goalkeepers. And not to go on too much of a tangent, but I think this has become a broader conversation, particularly within the women's game, and female goalkeepers. We see a lot of discourse around, you know, our female goalkeepers, are they able to, I suppose, produce the same quality of goalkeeping as male goalkeepers? Are they struggling within the same goal dimensions? Is it a height thing? Is it a training age thing? It's a very multifaceted picture, but you know, kind of tapping into more broadly I suppose the deficits of you know, movement skills within the women's game. I think a lot of it is down to the fact that female goalkeepers aren't, you know, exposed to the same physical training that male goalkeepers are growing up. So if we're looking at, you know, how can we improve them within the gym, or, you know, within kind of targeted physical work to go out onto the pitch, we need to really assess where it is that deficit occurs. A lot of it is, you know, vertical jump height. You know, we're just not doing enough training in terms of producing force vertically. You know, they're not doing enough, you know, as we might touch on, like intensive plyos. It might be more extensive, or with the wrong, I suppose, focus or outcome. But also something that Dave kind of spoke to me about in terms of what he sees within young male goalkeepers, but also a lot of senior female goalkeepers now, is that their movement lets them down, especially when it comes to balls over the top. A lot of them will tend to stay square on and shuffle backwards, maybe lose their footing. But I suppose my conversations with him would have led into, you know, drill design in terms of how we can get them to, you know, perform that kind of lateral shift where they're moving side on while still assessing the game, and seeing where the ball is, or the trajectory of the ball, but then being able to move backwards correctly, and then, you know, finish maybe with a constraint of, you know, a particular drill that we'd kind of designed together was using a cone kind of hanging off the crossbar, and having different colors, so they get to react to, you know, they might call yellow, blue, whatever it is. They're adjusting their body, side shuffling, and almost sticking the hand overhead to perform a save. That might be done with the football, but it's done in a more controlled environment. So without having gone on too much of a tangent, those conversations I think are just really important, between having a really kind of transparent and honest conversation in terms of what each of us want from each other.
I think that's a really, really good point about utilizing goalkeeper coaches. We've talked about it before about technical coaches, but probably referring more to outfield players. But the fact that you referenced it there with goalkeepers, obviously the context from club to club could be different. So a goalkeeper could turn around and say, yeah, let's try and add some more cognitive work into the work that you're doing. But like you say, that conversation is key, because you understand what they're doing, they understand what you're doing, but also how you're going to work together and how that work is going to cross over from side to side as well. So I think it's a really, really good point. That has absolutely flown by. I can't believe we've done sort of 50 minutes of recording already. But Jordan, have you got anything else just to sort of wrap things up before Oran gives details on where people can get in touch?
No, I just think that Oran's last point there is a really important one for young practitioners who are coming into maybe a first or second or third sort of S&C roles, where you can get bogged down in the fluff quite quickly, can't you? When you look at sort of, you know the classic reaction ball, the little small one that goes off in all different angles. You know, on the face of it, you look at, oh, it's going to improve my reaction time, but like straight away, like Oran said, actually getting a GK who's got a low training age to perform maybe some power cleans and getting really good at, you know, triple extension really quickly, really powerfully, like which one's more important? And then that point you made there in terms of a semi-pro environment, time is so critical that if you're wasting time on the fluff and not the actual real basics, nitty-gritty details, which are really going to improve, you know, a GK's overall performance, and outfielders for that matter as well, like just, you know, balance up and realize what you're doing, spending your time on. So I think that's a fantastic point for anyone, not just young practitioners, any practitioner really, and just in almost reevaluating your practice consistently to say, is it fluff? Is it beneficial? Which one is it? So genuinely, so I thought some brilliant points in there. So thank you very much, Aaron. Really, really, really good points.
I think just to finish on that as well, and like Ben had said, I think I suppose from a practitioner's perspective, you know, we're always trying to improve our relationship. I suppose maybe with the head coach, maybe with the assistant coach, but I suppose just remembering that the goalkeeping coach is as much a part of that picture, and I suppose being able to reconcile our kind of tasks and our demands with the goalkeeping coach as well. It's something that I see myself as often quite, I suppose, heavily neglected. So it's important that also the communication within a backroom staff includes you know, that direct dynamic between goalkeeping coach and S&C too.
And they fully understand the technicalities of what goes into goalkeeping as well, don't they? So they're going to look at it and give us some really good feedback on actually what needs to be developed too. So I think it's absolutely crucial and a really good point. Oran, that's been superb, mate. Thank you very much for coming on. That's the sort of episode that we wanted, with the detail that we wanted attached to it as well. So I really appreciate you going into that. I know that we could probably do a number of other episodes diving into each section even more, which you're more than welcome back on the podcast at any point to do. But do you want to just wrap us up with, if people want to get in touch, they want conversations, where would you direct them?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone wants to kind of get in touch further, they can follow me along on my Instagram. It's Oran.Donovan. If you want to get in touch on Twitter, it's at Oran_official. If they want to shoot me an email, it's Oran@Donovan.fitness. Any of those platforms, I'd love to kind of have a further conversation, I suppose. And, you know, whether it's you know, female footballers, whether it's goalkeepers, whether it's practitioners, you know, I'm always kind of more than willing and really enthusiastic about having those conversations between coach to player, coach to coach. And yeah, I suppose it's you know, I'm in this field for a reason, and it's because I enjoy having those conversations. So look, if there's anything I suppose I brought up here or anything you want to dive into further, just shoot me a message on any of those platforms, and I'll look to get back to you as soon as possible.
Amazing. Thank you, mate.
Thanks a million, Ben. Thanks, Jordan.
No worries. Well done, mate.
Jordan, we wanted to do this episode for a little bit, just make it specific for goalkeepers, and that we were just saying then, like, the detail there was top notch, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you can see Oran's passion for the subject. You can see his detail. It's superb. Like, and I think it's really important because I work with a few keepers myself now, and so that was incredibly useful for me, just because when you actually really, you can get lost in the rabbit hole, can't you? You can go properly into the detail, and then you go, look, we need to feed that movement into this movement and this movement, and before you know it, you've suddenly realised they're actually a completely different breed of athlete. So I think a really good breakdown from Oren there. And let's be fair, a lot of the time it is hard to specify training for GKs because of time. So certainly if you're in an environment where you're a bit of a one-man band or one-person band, you know, and you've got to try and do the whole squad in half an hour, it can be quite difficult to do that. But like he was saying, in terms of the prehab, in terms of some of the training, just by chatting to the coaches, the GK coaches, and then trying to integrate some of that into the work that you do in the gym, just by adding little bits and bobs in, is going to have a massive impact. And just taking GK away from just generic outfield players programs, I think it's got a real benefit. So yeah, fantastic breakdown.
Yeah, I thought those key areas where you spoke about accels, decels, but also the positions that they'll be accelerating and decelerating from, that's got to get your creative juices flowing a little bit in terms of drill design. And again, where he said about using the goalkeeper coach, I think that's where that has to come into as well, doesn't it? We didn't go into it as much, but you sort of referenced it towards the end, was the more focus on intensive plyometric work rather than extensive.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes sense in terms of the work to rest ratios and the type of movements that keepers are going to be doing.
Yeah.
The decel work, the landing capacities of players as well, both bilateral and unilateral, was important as well, wasn't it? And then just general sort of competencies in terms of frontal plane movements. He referenced the key areas, the hips, the T-spine, the scaps. These are all things that need to be considered, but that needs to go into what you've just mentioned in terms of what time have you got available, and then really utilizing that time that you've got and maybe getting it involved in some of the work that's already going on as well. So no, I thought it was a brilliant breakdown. I think we can break it down again even more, and I'm keen to do that because I think there's all these areas could be podcasting themselves.
Yeah.
But no, I think Oran did a brilliant job on talking about like the overall, the demands that are on this modern keeper now. and how that goes into programming. So no, really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it.
I think, yeah, and like I mentioned at the end as well, just cutting out the fluff. We're all very keen sometimes to go, oh, this looks fun, this looks fancy, let's try this.
The magpies, we get
Yeah,
checked.
like we are. You see something on, the Instagram coach, let's call them that, the one that sees something fancy, a reaction wall. We've all seen those, and yeah. But like I said, if time's your main constraint, focus on those basics. I think he made that really, really clear. And yeah, like you said, the crouch position, integrating that more into exercises, that's really going to help them in that set position in order to then spring away laterally or whichever way they move, the backward step and having to come over the top and overhead. Like when you actually think about it, how often are you integrating that into their training? It's a really, really good breakdown. Could definitely get him back on, and we could definitely make this a follow-up sort of episode and really try and pick his brains even more on that. So yeah, excellent episode.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time as well, mate. I appreciate it. Just final thing for me, just check out the sponsors. Good Prep, Hydro, and Rezzil. Go and give them a follow on socials for us. Show them a bit of love. And Jordan, bring on episode 310. We've got some big ones coming up, so keep an eye out for those.
We have. Should be good.